Hey, this is Rob, and I've been doing what I've been calling Mental Health Minute on my channel. Is kind of a little bit of a separate thing from my normal RV stuff. I'm a licensed counselor. I'm retired, but I do a little bit of private practice in retirement. And I was about to do another one, and I realized, this can't be explained in a minute. And it's something that I think is really valuable that I've been using with clients for quite a few years, and also has had a pretty big impact on my life. So I thought I'd do a little bit longer video and have it be for a little bit wider audience. And the topic is belief systems. And what I mean by that is, what things do you believe about yourself in the world that drive the kinds of decisions that you make in life? And how can bad beliefs, and by bad I don't mean morally bad, but dysfunctional beliefs, create problems for you in your life? We have the bulk of our beliefs about ourselves and about the world are acquired, I think, in childhood. And when I first started as a therapist about 20 years ago, I wasn't much of a believer in this, childhood stuff and family of origin, and I was more a believer in the school of what they call cognitive behavioral therapy. It's more here and now, logical thinking, and mistakes that we make in thinking. That it was very straightforward and logical to me, and that does still have its value. I consider myself a practicing cognitive behavioral therapy. I still believe in it. I think it has value. But I have discovered that stuff that happens in childhood can have an enormous impact on what's going on in your life. And I have found through experience that when I have a client that has cyclical circumstances / behaviors that are troublesome for them, and they can't seem to get out of these repeating patterns of dysfunctional stuff, inevitably I find that there is a dysfunctional belief or beliefs that have their origin in childhood. I've always had the belief that to be a good therapist, I was going to say you, but I'm only talking about myself here. For me to be a good therapist, I believe that I need to self-disclose, and I need to talk about my direct experience when it's applicable, when I think it's going to help someone. I think I'm pretty careful not to over-disclose, but when I think it's going to be helpful for someone to understand what's happened to me, it just works. People relate to really authentic stuff. So I'm going to start this with a story about a belief that I had in childhood. And by the way, what I didn't mention is these beliefs often are functional in childhood and become dysfunctional in adulthood. And the one I'm going to give to you now is a classic example. My father was of age, a teenager during the Depression. And so he has very strong, specific memories of the Depression era. And one of the things that came out of the Depression is you don't waste food. Food was hard to come by during the Depression. So the adage, eat everything on your plate, often has its origins in families during the Depression. And that was evidently a strong rule in my father's household, and it translated to me in this way. Growing up, I did not have a mother. My mother died very early on, and I'll be talking about that a little bit later. But let's go to 1965, and I'm 5 years old, and there was a housekeeper that would take care of me Monday through Friday, and she would go home on the weekends, and she would go by bus because she didn't have a driver's license or car. So she did not do grocery shopping. That was my father's job, and he would do grocery shopping once a week at his favorite market. It was called Loblaws, and I think for a little while it was A&P, but Loblaws was the chain, long since gone, I'm sure, that he loved, and he would take me with him. And let me tell you, I loved going to the grocery store with my dad. I loved spending time with my dad. I loved being in the grocery store. I just was so excited about doing that. And there was only one rule that my father had. I had to finish everything on my plate at dinner, or I could not go grocery shopping with him. And I have a vivid memory of sitting at the table with my food in front of me, and probably because I was fed snacks to keep me occupied after school, this night I just could not fit another bite in. No matter how much I tried, I couldn't. And the memory is sitting at the end of that table alone, doing the kind of sobbing, crying where you can't catch your breath, because I was sitting listening to my father's car pull out of the driveway and drive away without me. Vivid early memory. So it's the only time I can remember that I didn't get to go, so I obviously learned my lesson. I was sure to eat everything on my plate so I could go with my dad. So the belief that I should not leave the table, leave a meal without finishing everything on my plate, was functional for me as a child. It got me what I wanted. I desperately wanted to spend time with my dad. So, how did that affect me in adulthood? Well, think about this. So adulthood began for me in the late 70s and early 80s, and that pretty much coincides with a trend in restaurants. And the trend in restaurants became bigger and bigger portions. The era of the supersize and McDonald's, and you go to TGI Fridays for dinner and they just give you massive amounts of food. Well, guess what? I would, no matter whether I was full or not, did not factor into how much I ate. I ate what was on my plate, whether it was at home, whether it was at a restaurant. I learned to eat everything on my plate. Now, this contributed to, in a significant way, the weight problem I have been battling my entire life. It is not the only factor. It is not the root cause, but it certainly is a contributing factor to, because, hey, if you develop a belief that you eat everything in front of you and you don't go by whether you're full, that's a recipe for overeating. And the other thing I learned from my dad, he was a fast eater. He would eat, desserts were like 3 bites. So sitting and emulating my dad at the table, I still really struggle with the fast eating part. And the other thing is, if you eat too fast, you don't allow for the time delay in putting food into your system and the message getting to your brain that you're full. So those two things together made me a very unhealthy eater. And it was hard to break. It was hard to break the habit. I can remember, when I became aware of it as an adult, and I would, for example, be at a restaurant, and here's a failed attempt. I would slow down. I would give myself time, and I'd say, okay, I'm full, and I would put my fork down. I would continue whatever conversation I was having, and before I knew it, I was picking up food and eating it without even realizing when I was doing it. So that was a fail. And then when I got to the success was either just ask them to remove the plate or ask for a doggy bag, and once the food was safely in a doggy bag or styrofoam container, I was home free. But it was tough to break that habit. So it's a belief from childhood that I had that is directly attributable to how my father viewed food. Right? And did my dad mean harm by this? Of course he didn't. He was doing what he was taught. And he probably wasn't really conscious of the reasons for the rule, and it was automatic for him. I had a great dad. I loved my dad. So, but that was a small sliver of his parenting of me. Right? And a trend lately that I've seen online and on talk shows is therapists that talk about the concept of reparenting. And when I heard that term, I was like, what the hell does that mean? And what I discovered it means is something that I've been doing with clients for quite some time now, is that mistakes were made in your childhood. Mistakes were made. Most of the time, they were completely innocent or inadvertent mistakes were made. So we have to correct those mistakes, those, quote, parenting mistakes. We're adults now. It's not my dad's fault nor his responsibility to correct that. It's my responsibility to recognize it and correct it. Therefore, I have to correct some parenting that didn't really work well for me. Therefore, I'm going to reparent. And that's a pretty exciting concept because it really works. It worked for me. I don't eat everything on my plate anymore, right? You're probably looking at the picture saying, well, you didn't completely lick the weight problem. No, I mean, it's a lifetime, and it's going to be a lifetime fight, I'm sure, until the bitter end. But that part of it I've mastered. So that's an easy to identify, straightforward one. I got a bigger one in my life. And it's more complicated. So I'm going to tell you this story, and it's very personal. I actually asked my brothers and sisters each if they were okay with me telling this story because it's about our mother. And it's about my birth. So I was born in 1960, and one of my sisters tells a story about getting up in the middle of the night, I guess, to go to the bathroom, and she goes down the hall and encounters my mother coming down the hall, and with a big glowing smile on her face. And what was going on is she was in labor, and my dad was getting the car, I guess, and they were going to the hospital to have a baby, and my mom was very happy this was happening. I remember her sister Ann told me that my mom loved having babies and having children, and that was her life. She just absolutely loved that. So of course everyone was all excited that mom was going to come home with a new baby, brother or sister. They probably didn't know the genders back then, so a baby brother or sister. Instead, what happened at the hospital is that my mother went into labor and had a pulmonary embolism and went into cardiac arrest, which means you go into cardiac arrest, your heart stops, you're dead. And if you can't really resuscitate someone at the same time that you're going to do an emergency cesarean section to get the baby out. They got the baby out, me, but she died. So instead of the joyous occasion the whole family was expecting, my father came home with the devastating news to give to his 2 sons and 2 daughters that their mother had died. And of course, they were absolutely devastated. Grandparents came in right away. As I understand it, I had to stay in the hospital for a couple of days. And they brought me home. And I believe something happened when I got home, psychologically, to me. One of the ways that I believe you get beliefs, especially very early in childhood, and it doesn't get much earlier than this, is through a kinesthetic process. Babies don't have language, but they communicate kinesthetically. They understand emotion, right? So the emotional state that I encountered in my family was one of extreme grief that they'd lost their mother. Now, let me say this. I know the first question from my sisters when they heard the mother died is, where's that baby? You know, there was love for me from the very first moment. So I don't want anyone to misunderstand that I was not welcomed by my brothers and sisters and father. I was, in every way possible. But to a baby that's brought into that environment of extreme grief, I'm sorry that this keeps moving. I'm going to try to tighten this. You're brought into an environment with that kind of extreme grief, it's going to have an effect, right? I began to feel the effects of that as I grew up, when I began to have an awareness of the life the family had. I began to develop an awareness of the life this family had prior to her death and my birth. My dad worked for Kodak, so he actually had color films, and every once in a while, the families we'd all sit down and they would get out the movie projector and show old film clips of the family movies, slideshows, and I noticed everyone was there but me. So I began to have a feeling of separation. In other words, I felt separate from that part of their life. I began to feel separate from my brothers and sisters, and the realization that some kind of trade was made in my life for her life was, as I got older, got more and more present in me, and feelings of guilt, and I think survivor guilt that is more common with people when they're older, but I think it's a real thing for people whose mother died in childbirth. And it was certainly the case for me. And it created a feeling of separation from my family. That here's how it would manifest over the years is there's a great deal of age difference. The next oldest sibling is 10 years older than me, and the next one is 12 and 13 and 17 years. Yet we've remained close all these years. We've remained close, and we would get together as a family, certainly every 3 years or so. Now, I always look forward to these, quote, reunions, but inevitably after the first 24 hours, I would feel uneasy, uncomfortable, and not part of and not welcome. And I didn't understand, certainly in the first 20 or 30 years of this, why this was happening. So I would assign a reason, like, someone was short with me, or they weren't nice to me, or they said the wrong thing, and all that was bullshit, because it wasn't coming from anything that they were doing. It was coming from that sort of kinesthetic experience I had right after birth, and the experiences of guilt and beliefs that I wasn't part of the family, that I was responsible for my mother's death. And these were powerful beliefs that were having a pretty big impact, certainly on my relationship with my brothers and sisters, but it also was having a pretty big impact on relationships I had with others, and it made it in a very real way very difficult for me to form relationships with romantic relationships for a long period of time. There was this element of not feeling like I really belonged, combined with the element of I didn't have a mother growing up. What I had were a series of housekeepers and older sisters, and I gotta tell you, they all treated me so lovingly and so well, but they all left. They all left. And I developed a belief that women leave me. And that's just a belief that I had that I didn't really understood that I carried with me. And that led to obvious problems in relationships. It would explain why I never really got married and developed a family of my own. So I've been working through those feelings for years now. I've been working through those beliefs. I don't believe anymore. There isn't any real part of me that believes I'm responsible for my mother's death. I get together with my brothers and sisters now, and I don't have that sense that I'm separate or not accepted or not part of those. Through the work that I've done in therapy, those things are gone, and I'm at peace. But I'm telling you these very personal things so you can maybe, if you're having cyclical problems in your life, what beliefs maybe have you adopted from childhood that aren't true? Beliefs about yourself and beliefs about the world. And hopefully sharing this with all of you, if it helps one or two people, I'll be a pretty happy guy. I hope you've enjoyed the Talk and Drive.